Margaret Thompson had always been drawn to the sound of hoofbeats on morning dew. Living in the small farming community of Cedar Ridge, she would often pause her daily chores to watch the horses gallop across the distant fields. But none captured her attention quite like the mysterious figure who rode alone each dawn, always dressed in the same weathered brown coat and dark pants, always keeping his distance from the other ranch hands. The townspeople called him Samuel, though few knew his last name. He had arrived in Cedar Ridge 3 years earlier, seeking work at the Morrison Ranch on the outskirts of town. Unlike the other workers who lived in the shared bunkhouse, Samuel had built himself a small cabin deep in the woods, away from prying eyes and gossip-filled conversations. The ranch owner, old Mr. Morrison, had taken a liking to Samuel's quiet dedication and exceptional skill with horses. But even he knew little about the man's past. Margaret first spoke to Samuel on a Tuesday morning in late September. She had been walking to the general store when she noticed a commotion near the town square. A merchant's horse had broken free from its cart and was rearing wildly, sending people scrambling for safety. Without hesitation, Samuel appeared as if from nowhere, moving with calm confidence toward the frightened animal. She watched, mesmerized, as Samuel approached the horse with slow, deliberate movements. He spoke in gentle whispers that seemed to float on the autumn air, his hands extended peacefully. Within minutes, the wild horse had calmed, allowing Samuel to secure it safely back to the cart. The grateful merchant offered payment, but Samuel simply tipped his worn hat and walked away. Disappearing as quietly as he had arrived, Margaret found herself following him at a distance, curious about this enigmatic man who seemed to possess an almost magical connection with horses. She discovered that Samuel visited the old cemetery at the edge of town every Tuesday, always carrying a small bundle of wildflowers. He would kneel beside a grave marked with a simple wooden cross. Speaking softly to someone who could no longer answer back, intrigued by his gentle nature and mysterious habits, Margaret began finding excuses to be in places where she might encounter Samuel. She learned that he purchased his meager supplies from the general store on the same day each week, always paying with exact change and never lingering for conversation. The store owner, Mrs. Patterson, mentioned that Samuel had been wearing the same clothes since his arrival in town, though they were always remarkably clean despite his demanding work with horses. One evening, Margaret gathered the courage to approach Samuel as he sat alone on the fence surrounding Morrison's property, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. Her heart pounded as she walked across the field toward him, unsure of what she would say but knowing she had to try to understand this solitary man who had captured her imagination. Samuel looked up as she approached, his deep brown eyes reflecting both surprise and caution. Margaret noticed how carefully he held himself, as if afraid that any sudden movement might cause her to flee. She introduced herself simply, mentioning that she had seen his remarkable way with horses and wondered if he might teach her something about handling them. To her surprise, Samuel's reserved expression softened into something resembling a smile. He spoke quietly about horses, explaining how they could sense fear and kindness in equal measure, how patience and understanding were worth more than force or harsh commands. His voice carried a gentle wisdom that made Margaret want to listen for hours. As weeks passed, these evening conversations became a cherished routine for both of them. Samuel would finish his work at the ranch and find Margaret waiting by the fence, sometimes bringing fresh bread or coffee to share. She learned that he had grown up on a horse farm far from Cedar Ridge, that he had lost his family in a terrible accident, and that horses were the only creatures that brought him peace in a world that often felt too painful to. Margaret began to notice the way other townspeople looked at Samuel with a mixture of suspicion and disdain. They whispered about his isolation, his strange habits, and especially about his unchanging wardrobe. Some speculated that he was hiding something shameful, others suggested he was simply too poor or too proud to ask for help. The cruel nickname, the Outcast Horseman, followed him wherever he went. But Samuel seemed to accept their judgment with quiet resignation. Despite the town's disapproval, Margaret found herself falling deeply in love with Samuel's gentle spirit and wounded soul. She saw past his mysterious exterior to the kind, intelligent man beneath. When he smiled at her jokes or shared stories about the horses he cared for, she felt a warmth she had never experienced before. Samuel, in turn, seemed to bloom under her attention, becoming more talkative and relaxed in her presence. The first time Samuel took Margaret riding, she understood why horses trusted him so completely. He moved with them as if he were part of their world, communicating through subtle shifts in posture and breathing that spoke louder than words. Sitting behind him on his favorite horse, a gentle Mare named Luna, Margaret felt safer and more alive than she ever had before. Their relationship deepened throughout the winter months. Samuel would arrive at Margaret's family home in the evenings, always properly dressed despite his limited wardrobe, always respectful to her parents despite their obvious concern about his reputation. Margaret's father, a practical man who valued hard work above social status, gradually warmed to Samuel after witnessing his dedication and integrity. Her mother remained more skeptical, particularly troubled by the persistent rumors surrounding Samuel's past and his peculiar attachment to his everyday clothes when spring arrived. Samuel surprised everyone by asking Margaret's father for permission to marry her. The proposal was simple and heartfelt, taking place during one of their evening rides as wildflowers bloomed across the meadows they loved to explore together. Margaret said yes without hesitation, knowing that she would rather face an uncertain future with Samuel than a predictable life without him. The engagement announcement caused quite a stir in Cedar Ridge. Many townspeople couldn't understand why someone as lovely and well-regarded as Margaret would choose to marry the strange horseman who lived alone in the woods. Some of her friends expressed concerns about Samuel's secretive nature, particularly his mysterious past, and his seemingly obsessive attachment to his unchanging attire. Margaret's mother pulled her aside one evening, expressing her worries about marrying a man who clearly harbored secrets. She pointed out that Samuel had never explained why he lived in isolation, why he never spoke of his life before Cedar Ridge, or why he seemed incapable of wearing anything other than the same brown coat and dark pants he had arrived in 3 years earlier. But Margaret had made her decision with her heart, not her head. She believed that love could overcome any obstacle, that patience and understanding would eventually unlock whatever secret Samuel carried. She trusted that the man who could calm wild horses with gentle whispers would never harm her. Regardless of what mysteries surrounded his past, the wedding was planned for early summer, to be held in the small church where Margaret had attended services since childhood. Samuel agreed to the traditional ceremony, though he seemed nervous about the attention it would bring. He had lived quietly on the margins of society for so long that the thought of standing before the entire community filled him with visible anxiety. As the wedding day approached, Margaret noticed that Samuel's mysterious behavior seemed to intensify rather than diminish. He would disappear for hours without explanation, always returning with apologies but never with answers about where he had been. His visits to the cemetery became more frequent, and she sometimes caught him staring at his reflection with an expression she couldn't quite understand. The night before their wedding, Margaret found Samuel sitting by the creek that ran behind her family's property. Moonlight reflected off the water as she approached, and she could see that he was trembling slightly despite the warm evening air. When she asked if he was having doubts about their marriage, Samuel took her hands and assured her that she was the best thing that had ever happened to him, but there was something in his eyes that night, a deep sadness that seemed to extend far beyond normal wedding nerves. When Margaret asked if there was anything he needed to tell her before they became husband and wife, Samuel was quiet for a long moment before saying that some truths were too difficult to share until the right time came. Margaret chose to trust him, believing that their love would be strong enough to weather whatever revelation awaited them. As she lay in bed that night, listening to the gentle sounds of night creatures and thinking about the life she was about to begin, she had no idea that Samuel's secret would challenge everything she thought she knew about love, loyalty, and the power of the human spirit to endure unimaginable loss. The wedding day dawned bright and clear, with a gentle breeze that carried the scent of blooming apple trees across the church grounds. Margaret wore her grandmother's wedding dress, carefully preserved in tissue paper and carrying the dreams of generations of women who had believed in the power of love to transform lives. Samuel arrived at the church, wearing the same brown coat he had worn every day since coming to Cedar Ridge, but Margaret noticed that it had. The first months of married life brought Margaret a happiness she had never imagined possible. Samuel moved from his isolated cabin into the small house Margaret had inherited from her grandmother, located just outside Cedar Ridge's main settlement. Together, they transformed the neglected property into a warm, welcoming home surrounded by gardens that attracted butterflies and hummingbirds. Samuel proved to be a devoted husband in every way except one. Margaret quickly discovered that his attachment to his unchanging wardrobe went far deeper than simple habit or financial necessity. Each evening, Samuel would carefully wash and mend his brown coat and dark pants, treating them with a reverence that puzzled and sometimes frustrated his new wife. Margaret had assumed that once they were married and sharing a household, Samuel would naturally expand his clothing options. She had even purchased several new shirts and another pair of pants as wedding gifts, hoping to surprise him with varieties that would make his daily work more comfortable. But the gifts remained unworn in their bedroom dresser, while Samuel continued his ritual of wearing, washing, and carefully storing the same two pieces of clothing. When Margaret gently questioned Samuel about the unused clothes, he would become visibly uncomfortable, changing the subject or finding urgent tasks that required his immediate attention. She began to notice that any discussion related to his clothing choices caused Samuel genuine distress. His usual calm demeanor replaced by something that looked almost like panic. Their neighbor, Mrs. Jenkins, made frequent comments about Samuel's unchanging appearance during her weekly visits to borrow sugar or share local gossip. She would shake her head disapprovingly while mentioning how peculiar it was for a married man to dress like a hermit, suggesting that perhaps Margaret needed to take a firmer hand in managing her husband's choices. These conversations left Margaret feeling defensive of Samuel while simultaneously struggling with her own growing concerns. She loved her husband deeply, but she couldn't understand why someone who was otherwise completely rational would cling so desperately to two pieces of clothing. The mystery began to create a small but persistent tension in their otherwise harmonious marriage. Samuel's work at Morrison Ranch continued to flourish. His reputation as a horse handler had spread to neighboring communities, bringing visitors who specifically requested his expertise with difficult or traumatized animals. Mr. Morrison often praised Samuel's unique ability to communicate with horses that others had given up on, saying he had never seen anything quite like it in 40 years of ranching. Margaret loved watching Samuel work with the horses. There was something almost mystical about the way he moved among them, his presence immediately calming even the most skittish animals. She noticed that horses seemed to recognize something in Samuel that humans missed, accepting him with a trust that was both beautiful and somehow heartbreaking to witness. But the townspeople's attitude toward Samuel remained largely unchanged despite his marriage to a well-respected local woman. If anything, some seemed more suspicious of his motives, wondering what hold he had over Margaret to convince her to marry beneath her social standing. The whispers followed them to church services, market days, and community gatherings, creating an atmosphere of constant judgment that wore on both of them. One particularly difficult incident occurred during the town's harvest festival. Margaret had convinced Samuel to attend, hoping that participating in community events might help change people's perceptions of him. Samuel reluctantly agreed, though Margaret noticed his anxiety building throughout the week leading up to the celebration. At the festival, Samuel's unchanged appearance stood out starkly among the other men who had dressed in their finest clothes for the occasion. While Margaret wore a beautiful new dress she had sewn specifically for the event, Samuel appeared in his usual brown coat and dark pants, meticulously clean but unmistakably the same garments he wore every single day. The contrast became a source of whispered commentary among the other attendees. Margaret overheard several women discussing whether Samuel was too proud, too poor, or simply too strange to dress appropriately for special occasions. One particularly cruel comment suggested that perhaps he had stolen the clothes he wore and was afraid to risk wearing anything else that might draw attention to his theft. Samuel endured the stares and whispers with his typical quiet dignity, but Margaret could see the pain in his eyes as the evening progressed. When a group of men invited him to join their card game, Samuel politely declined, explaining that he preferred to help Margaret with the food preparation. But Margaret suspected that he was simply avoiding situations where his appearance might become an even greater source of speculation and ridicule. The walk home that night was unusually quiet. Margaret could sense Samuel's internal struggle, though he maintained his gentle demeanor and asked thoughtful questions about her enjoyment of the festivities. But when she tried to address the obvious discomfort he had experienced, Samuel simply said that some people were not meant for social gatherings, and that he was content with their quiet life together. As autumn deepened into winter, Margaret began to notice other peculiar patterns in Samuel's behavior related to his clothing. He would never allow her to handle his washing, insisting on doing it himself, despite her offers to help with household chores. On the rare occasions when his clothes needed significant mending, Samuel would work by candlelight long into the night, stitching with a precision and care that suggested these garments held value far beyond their practical function. Margaret also discovered that Samuel kept a small wooden box hidden beneath their bed, carefully wrapped in an old blanket. When she accidentally found it while cleaning, Samuel's reaction was swift and intense. He gently but firmly explained that the box contained personal items from his past, things that were too painful to discuss, but too important to discard. Margaret respected his privacy, but the incident left her wondering what memories could be so overwhelming that they couldn't be shared even with a loving wife. The isolation of winter gave Margaret more time to observe Samuel's daily routines and to notice details she had missed during their courtship. She realized that Samuel's attachment to his clothing was connected to something much deeper than simple habit or stubbornness. There were moments when she caught him touching the fabric of his coat with an expression of profound sadness, as if the material itself held some crucial connection to a part of his life he couldn't bear to release. One snowy evening in February, Margaret decided to approach the subject more directly. She had prepared Samuel's favorite meal and waited until they were relaxed by the fireplace before gently asking if there was something special about his clothes that made them so important to him. Samuel was quiet for such a long time that Margaret wondered if he had heard her question. When Samuel finally spoke, his voice carried a weight of sorrow that made Margaret's heart ache for him. He explained that the clothes he wore every day were connected to the most important person he had ever lost, someone whose memory he honored through this daily ritual. But when Margaret asked for more details, hoping to understand and support him through whatever grief he carried, Samuel became overwhelmed and excused himself to check on the horses. Even though night had already fallen, Margaret began to research ways to help someone process grief and loss, reading everything she could find about how people cope with traumatic memories. She learned that some individuals develop attachment behaviors to objects that connect them to departed loved ones. But she couldn't understand why Samuel seemed so afraid to share these memories with someone who loved him unconditionally. The mystery deepened when Margaret discovered that Samuel maintained extensive correspondence with someone in a distant city. Letters would arrive monthly, and Samuel would spend hours crafting careful responses, always using his finest handwriting and choosing his words with obvious care. When Margaret asked about the letters, Samuel explained that he was maintaining contact with someone from his past, but he seemed reluctant to provide any additional details. Spring brought new challenges to their marriage as Margaret struggled with increasing frustration about the walls Samuel maintained around certain aspects of his life. She loved him completely and wanted to support him through whatever pain he carried, but his refusal to trust her with his deepest secrets was beginning to feel like a rejection of their partnership. The situation reached a crisis point during one of Samuel's unexplained absences. He had left early one morning, saying only that he had important business to attend to and would return by evening. But hours passed with no word from him, and Margaret found herself consumed with worry about where he had gone and why he felt he couldn't share his plans with her. When Samuel finally returned home near midnight, he was emotionally exhausted and physically drained. His clothes showed signs of a long journey, and there were traces of tears on his face that he tried unsuccessfully to hide from Margaret. She held him without asking questions, sensing that he needed comfort more than explanations. But the incident left her feeling more isolated from her husband than ever before. The next morning, Margaret made a decision that would change the course of their marriage forever. She told Samuel that Margaret's investigation led her to an unexpected source of information about Samuel's past. Mrs. Patterson from the general store mentioned that Samuel's monthly letters came from a woman named Sarah Mitchell in Springfield, a town about 3 days' travel from Cedar Ridge. The return address had caught Mrs. Patterson's attention because it was written in an elegant feminine handwriting that seemed to belong to someone of education and refinement. Driven by a mixture of curiosity and desperation to understand her husband, Margaret wrote to Sarah Mitchell, introducing herself as Samuel's wife and explaining that she was trying to help him work through some difficult memories from his past. She mailed the letter secretly, uncertain whether she was betraying Samuel's trust, but knowing that their marriage couldn't survive without honesty between them. Sarah Mitchell's response arrived 2 weeks later, containing information that left Margaret both heartbroken and amazed by the depth of Samuel's capacity for love and loyalty. Sarah explained that she was Samuel's former sister-in-law, the widow of his beloved younger brother Thomas, who had died in a tragic accident 5 years earlier. The letter revealed that Samuel, Thomas, and Thomas's wife Emily had been inseparable since childhood. Samuel had raised Thomas after their parents died in a house fire when Thomas was only 12 years old. The two brothers had worked together on a horse ranch, with Samuel teaching Thomas everything he knew about handling and training horses. When Thomas married Emily, the three of them had lived together like a close-knit family, sharing dreams of expanding their horse breeding operation and building a life centered around their shared love of animals. Sarah's letter continued, with details that explained Samuel's mysterious behavior and his attachment to his unchanging clothes. On the day of the accident, Samuel and Thomas had been wearing matching outfits that Emily had sewn for them as a surprise gift. She had spent weeks creating identical brown coats and dark pants, wanting to give the brothers something special that reflected their partnership and mutual devotion. The accident had occurred during a violent thunderstorm while Samuel and Thomas were trying to rescue horses trapped in a flooding barn. A lightning strike had caused part of the barn roof to collapse, pinning Thomas beneath heavy wooden beams while Samuel watched helplessly. In Thomas's final moments, he had made Samuel promise to take care of Emily and to never forget the happiness they had shared as a family. Samuel had carried Thomas's dying body home in those clothes, and Emily had died from grief and illness just 3 months later, unable to recover from the loss of her young husband. Before Emily's death, she had begged Samuel to promise that he would wear the clothes she had made until he found someone who could love him the way she had loved Thomas, someone who could give him the family happiness that had been stolen from all of them. The revelation hit Margaret like a physical blow as she realized the incredible weight of responsibility and memory that Samuel carried every single day. His unchanging clothes were not a sign of poverty or stubbornness, but a sacred promise to two people he had loved more than his own life. Every day he wore those garments, he was honoring the memory of his brother and keeping faith with Emily's dying wish that he would find love again. Sarah's letter also explains Samuel's monthly correspondence and his mysterious absences. He had been sending money to help Sarah care for Thomas and Emily's graves, and his periodic journeys were pilgrimages to visit their resting place and report on his life to the brother he still missed desperately. The small wooden box hidden under their bed contained Thomas's wedding ring and Emily's final letter to Samuel. Treasures too precious and painful for him to share with anyone, Margaret spent days absorbing this information, understanding for the first time why Samuel had seemed so afraid to love her completely. In his mind, accepting happiness with her meant potentially breaking faith with Thomas and Emily, whose deaths he still blamed himself for despite the fact that the accident had been completely beyond his control. Armed with this knowledge, Margaret knew she had to approach Samuel with careful consideration for the enormous emotional burden he had carried alone for so many years. She planned her approach carefully, waiting for one of their quiet evening walks when Samuel seemed most relaxed and open to conversation. As they strolled through the meadow where Samuel had proposed marriage, Margaret gently told him that she had learned about Thomas and Emily. Samuel's initial reaction was shock and fear. Terrified that Margaret would reject him now that she understood the complicated nature of his loyalties and the promises that still governed his daily choices, but instead of anger or disappointment, Margaret expressed profound admiration for Samuel's faithfulness and his capacity for enduring love. She told him that understanding his story made her love him even more, not less, because it revealed the depth of his character and his ability to honor commitments even when they came at great personal cost. Margaret assured Samuel that she didn't want to replace Thomas and Emily in his heart, but rather to create new space for happiness that could coexist with his cherished memories. She suggested that perhaps Thomas and Emily would want him to be happy, that their love for him would include wanting him to find peace and joy rather than eternal grief and isolation. The conversation that followed was the most honest and emotional exchange of their marriage. Samuel wept as he described the guilt he felt for surviving when Thomas had died, the loneliness he had endured since losing the only family he had known, and the fear that loving Margaret completely might somehow dishonor the memory of the brother and sister-in-law who had shaped his understanding of what family meant. Margaret listened with patience and compassion, holding Samuel as he released years of suppressed grief and guilt. She assured him that love was not a finite resource that had to be rationed carefully, but rather something that could grow and expand to encompass all the important people in someone's life, both living and dead, together. They developed a plan that would honor Samuel's promises while allowing their marriage to flourish without the weight of unspoken secrets. Samuel would continue wearing his special clothes on significant days, anniversaries, holidays, and during his visits to Thomas and Emily's graves, but he would also begin wearing the gifts Margaret had given him and new clothes they would choose. Together, the transformation in their relationship was immediate and profound. Samuel began sharing stories about his life with Thomas and Emily, allowing Margaret to understand the experiences that had shaped him into the gentle, horse-loving man she had fallen in love with. Margaret, in turn, helped Samuel see that honoring the past didn't require rejecting the present. That happiness could be a tribute to lost loved ones rather than a betrayal of their memory. Samuel's next visit to Springfield included Margaret for the first time. She met Sarah Mitchell and visited the graves where Samuel had spent so many solitary hours maintaining his vigil of memory and grief. Margaret placed flowers on Thomas and Emily's graves and silently thanked them for raising Samuel to be the kind of man who could love so deeply and faithfully. The visit marked a turning point in Samuel's healing process. For the first time since the accident, he was able to speak to Thomas and Emily about his new happiness without feeling guilty or disloyal. With Margaret beside him, he could envision a future that honored the past while embracing new possibilities for love and family back in Cedar Ridge. The changes in Samuel were apparent to everyone who knew him. While he continued to be quiet and reserved by nature, there was a lightness in his demeanor that hadn't been there before. He began participating more actively in community events, and his relationship with the townspeople gradually improved as they witnessed the obvious happiness in his marriage. Samuel's reputation as a horseman continued to grow, but now people also began to see him as a devoted husband and a man of remarkable integrity. The story of his faithfulness to his deceased brother and sister-in-law, when it eventually became known in the community, transformed him from an object of suspicion into someone worthy of respect and admiration. Margaret and Samuel's love story became a source of inspiration for other couples in Cedar Ridge. demonstrating that true love could overcome secrecy, overcome past trauma, and create new happiness without destroying cherished memories. Their marriage proved that love was not about forgetting the past but about creating space for healing and growth while honoring the experiences that had shaped them. The small wooden box that had once been hidden beneath their bed found a new place of honor on their bedroom dresser, its contents no longer secret but rather shared treasures that connected Margaret to the family history that had made Samuel who he was. Thomas's wedding ring and Emily's letter became bridges between past and present, reminding them both that love could transcend death and that happiness could coexist with remembrance. Samuel continued to visit Thomas and Emily's graves, but now his journeys were less frequent and no longer driven by guilt or desperate longing. Instead, they became opportunities to share news of his continued healing and to maintain the loving connection that death had interrupted but not destroyed. Years later, when Samuel and Margaret had children of their own, they would tell their little ones stories about Uncle Thomas and